The room was too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, where you can hear your own thoughts settle like dust motes in a sunbeam. No, this was the kind of silence that presses against your chest, heavy and unyielding, like a stone you didn't realize you were carrying until it crushed you. I stood in the middle of my daughter's pristine living room, the air thick with the scent of lemon polish and freshly brewed coffee, my hands clutching a tray of sandwiches I'd spent all morning preparing. The bread was homemade, the crusts just the way she liked them, golden, slightly crisp. I'd even cut them into those neat little triangles she used to beg for as a child. But there they sat, untouched, on the glass coffee table, surrounded by her friends' laughter and chatter. Nobody looked at me. Not really. Oh, they smiled politely when I walked in, murmured their thanks as I set the tray down, but their eyes slid past me like I was part of the furniture. "Eleanor, you're a gem," my daughter, Sarah, had said, her voice bright but distracted, already turning back to her conversation about some new gallery opening. A gem. Like I was a shiny trinket, useful but forgettable. I stood there, 68 years old, my gray hair neatly pinned, my cardigan pressed, feeling like a ghost in my own daughter's house. I wanted to scream, to smash the tray against the wall and watch the sandwiches scatter like my pride, but instead, I smiled. I always smiled. The drive home was a blur. The radio played some upbeat pop song, all synthetic beats and shallow lyrics, but it couldn't drown out the ache in my chest. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles whitening, and felt the sting of tears I refused to let fall. When had it started, this fading? When had I become the woman who was thanked but not seen, who was loved but not valued? My husband, George, gone 5 years now, used to say I was the heartbeat of our family. But without him, I was just background noised. I pulled into the driveway of our old house, my house now, though it still felt like ours. The roses I'd planted decades ago were blooming, their petals a defiant red against the peeling paint of the fence. I sat in the car, engine off, staring at them. They were still here, still vibrant, despite the years. Why couldn't I be? That was revealed the moment I decided I wouldn't stay invisible. I didn't know how, or where, or what it. The next morning, I woke up with a fire in my belly I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger, not exactly, but something sharper, resolve. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where George and I used to share coffee and dreams, and I made a list. Not a grocery list or a to-do list, but a list of everything I'd stopped doing because I thought my time for it had passed. Painting. Traveling. Learning something new. I'd always wanted to live by the sea, to wake up to the sound of waves and the smell of salt air. George and I had planned to retire to the coast, but after he died, I let that dream die too. No more. I spent weeks researching, scrolling through listings on my ancient laptop, sipping tea that had gone cold. I found a small cottage for rent in a coastal town called Haven's Edge, 3 hours away. It was nothing fancy, a weathered shingle house with a porch overlooking the dunes, but the photos made my heart skip. The ocean was right there, vast and endless, like a promise of something bigger. I called the landlord, a gruff man named Tom who sounded like he smoked too many cigars. "It's available," he said. "But it's a quiet town. Not much to do for an older lady." I almost laughed. Older lady. He had no idea who he was talking to. Packing was harder than I expected. Not because of the stuff, I'd never been one for clutter, but because every corner of the house held memories. George's armchair, worn in all the right places. The dent in the wall from when Sarah tried to ride her tricycle indoors. I wrapped my favorite teacup in newspaper, the one with the chipped handle that George always teased me about, and I cried. Not for long, just enough to let the weight of it all slip out. Then I wiped my face and kept going. The drive to Haven's Edge was like stepping into a painting. The highway gave way to winding roads lined with wildflowers, and the air grew sharp with salt as I neared the coast. When I pulled up to the cottage, the wind was whipping through the dune grass, and the ocean roared like it was welcoming me home. I stood on the porch, my cardigan flapping against my ribs, and breathed it in. The smell of seaweed and wet sand, the gritty feel of salt on my skin, it was real. For the first time in years, I felt real too. But standing there, I also felt the weight of what I'd done. I'd left my life. The first week in Haven's Edge was a blur of unpacking and learning the quirks of the cottage, the creaky floorboards, the temperamental water heater. I wandered the town, a cluster of weathered shops and clapboard houses nestled against the cliffs. The locals were polite but distant, eyeing me like I was a tourist who'd wandered too far from the main road. I didn't mind. I wasn't here to make friends, not yet. I was here to find myself. That changed at the Driftwood Cafe. It was a cozy place, all mismatched chairs and sea glass chandeliers, with the best blueberry scones I'd ever tasted. I was sitting by the window, sketching the waves in a cheap notebook I'd bought at the corner store, when someone spoke. "You an artist?" The voice was warm, gravelly, like she'd spent her life shouting over the wind. I looked up to see a woman about my age, her hair a wild tangle of silver curls, her eyes crinkling with mischief. "Hardly," I said, closing the notebook. "Just doodling." She slid into the chair across from me without asking. "Name's Rosa. I run the pottery shop down the street." "You're new here, right?" I nodded, unsure whether to be annoyed or charmed. "Eleanor. Just moved in." Rosa leaned back, studying me. "Haven's Edge doesn't get many newcomers. Takes guts to start over at our age." Her smile was knowing, like she'd seen right through me. Over coffee, she told me her story. She'd been a lawyer in Boston, sharp as a tack, until a divorce and a heart attack made her rethink everything. She moved here 10 years ago, learned to throw clay, and never looked back. "Life's too short to live someone else's version of it," she said, and I felt a pang of recognition. Rosa became my first friend. She introduced me to others, each with their own jagged edges and stories. There was Marcus, a retired fisherman with hands like leather and a laugh that rattled the windows. He'd lost his wife to cancer and his son to a fight they never resolved, but he ran the local book club with a quiet passion that made my heart ache. Then there was Lila, barely 50 but with the weary eyes of someone older, who owned the cafe and baked her grief into every scone. Her daughter had run off with some drifter, and she hadn't heard from her in years. And Tom, my landlord, who turned out to be a softy under all that gruffness, always tinkering with his old sailboat and telling stories about his days as a Navy cook. These people weren't just strangers, they were lifelines. They didn't know me as Sarah's mother or George's widow. To them, I was Eleanor, the woman who sketched the ocean and laughed at Rose's terrible puns. For the first time in years, I felt seen. The first real fight came 3 months in. I'd joined Rosa's pottery class, mostly to humor her. My hands were clumsy with the clay, my bowls lopsided, but there was something freeing about the mess. One evening, as we cleaned up, Rosa asked why I'd moved here. I shrugged, mumbled something about needing a change. She pressed, her eyes sharp. "Come on, Eleanor. Nobody uproots their life at your age for no reason." I snapped. "Maybe I just wanted to breathe, okay? Maybe I was tired of being invisible." The words came out harsher than I meant, and the room went quiet. Rosa didn't flinch. She just nodded, like she'd been waiting for it. Later, she apologized, but it stuck with me. I'd spent so long hiding my pain, even from myself, that saying it out loud felt like breaking a bone to reset it. Then there was Marcus. He invited me to book club, where we read dog-eared paperbacks and argued about symbolism over cheap wine. One night, We read a novel about a woman who left her family to chase a dream. The discussion turned personal, too personal. Marcus said, "Sometimes you gotta let go of the people who hold you back, even if it hurts." I froze. Was that what I'd done? Left Sarah behind because she made me feel small? The thought gnawed at me, and I left early, my hands shaking as I unlocked my door. The hardest moment came with Lila. We'd grown close, sharing stories over late-night tea at the cafe. She told me about her daughter, and I told her about Sarah, how I'd raised her alone after George died, how I'd poured everything into her, only to feel like an afterthought now. Lila listened, her eyes soft, but then she said, "You can't make someone love you the way you need. Sometimes you have to love yourself first." It was like a slap. I wanted to argue, to say she didn't understand, but deep down, I knew she was right. These moments, the fights, the truths, cracked me open. I started painting again, not just sketches but real canvases, bold strokes of blue and gold inspired by the ocean. I joined Marcus on his boat, learned to tie knots, and laughed until my sides hurt. I helped Lila bake, my hands dusted with flour, and felt the warmth of her gratitude. Slowly, I was rebuilding, not just my life but my sense of who I was. But the past wasn't done with me yet. Sarah called 6 months after I moved. I was sitting on the porch, painting the sunset, when my phone buzzed. Her voice was sharp, accusing. "Mom, where are you?" I went by the house, and it's empty. I told her about Haven's Edge, my voice steady but my heart pounding. She was quiet for a long time, then said, "You didn't even tell me." The hurt in her voice cut deeper than I expected. I invited her to visit, bracing myself. When she arrived, she looked out of place in her city clothes, her arms crossed as she stood on the porch. We talked, really talked, for the first time in years. I told her how I'd felt at her party, how I'd been fading long before that day. She cried, said she hadn't realized that she'd been caught up in her own life. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. When she left, she hugged me, and I felt a piece of my heart slot back into place. The final shadow was George. I'd carried his memory like a talisman, but it was time to let go. One night, I walked to the beach, the sand cold under my feet, and scattered a handful of his ashes into the waves. I spoke to him, my voice soft against the roar of the tide. "I'm okay now, love. I'm living." It wasn't closure, not exactly, but it was peace. Haven's Edge is my home now. I wake up to the sound of gulls, paint the sunrise, and laugh with Rosa over lopsided pottery. Marcus teaches me about the stars, and Lila bakes me scones when I'm sad. I'm not the woman I was a year ago, shrinking into the background of someone else's life. I'm Eleanor, artist, friend, survivor. I think about that day at Sarah's party, the sandwiches and the silence, and I don't feel bitter anymore. It was the push I needed to choose myself. I'm 68, but I'm not done. I'm learning, growing, living. And if I can do it, so can you. Don't wait for someone else to see your worth. Don't let the world tell you your time is up. Step into the light, wherever it leads you. Share your story. Live it. The days in Haven's Edge began to take on a rhythm, like the tide pulling in and out. I woke early, the sky still bruised with dawn, and walked the beach with a thermos of coffee, the kind George used to make, strong enough to wake the dead, he'd say with a wink. The sand was cool under my bare feet, gritty and real, and the ocean's roar drowned out the noise in my head. I'd always thought of myself as a city woman, tethered to routines and responsibilities, but here, with the wind tugging at my scarf and the gulls crying overhead, I felt untethered. Free, but also unsteady, like a boat cut loose from its moorings. I started painting more seriously, setting up an easel on the porch. The ocean was my muse, its moods, its colors, the way it could be glass smooth one day and furious the next. I painted the dunes at sunrise, the light catching the grass like fire. I painted the fishing boats bobbing in the harbor, their hulls weathered but proud. My hands, once stiff with arthritis, felt alive again, smudged with cobalt and ochre. Rosa caught me one morning, paint on my cheek, and laughed. "You're a mess, Eleanor, but a beautiful one." I grinned, feeling lighter than I had in years. The town was small, but it had a heartbeat. I learned its pulse at the Driftwood Cafe, where Lila brewed coffee that tasted like home and Marcus argued with anyone who'd listen about the best way to grill fish. I started helping out at the cafe on weekends, wiping down tables and chatting with regulars. There was old Mr. Callahan, who came every morning for a scone and told stories about Haven's Edge in the 60s, when it was just a handful of shacks and dreamers. And Jenny, a young mother who always looked exhausted but smiled when I slipped an extra cookie to her son, Timmy. These interactions, small as they were, wove me into the fabric of this place. I wasn't just Eleanor, the newcomer. I was Eleanor, who knew Timmy liked chocolate chips and Mr. Callahan hated decaf, but freedom came with a price. At night, when the cottage was quiet except for the creak of the pipes, doubts crept in. Had I run away? Was I selfish for leaving Sarah, for choosing myself over the life I'd built? I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, the moonlight casting shadows like ghosts. I'd think of George, his laugh, the way he'd hold my hand under the table during family dinners. I'd think of Sarah, her childhood braids and gap-toothed grin, and wonder if I'd failed her by not being enough. Those nights were heavy, but they were also honest. For the first time, I let myself feel the weight of my choices, not to drown in them, but to understand them. Rosa was relentless. "You need to show your paintings," she said one afternoon, her hands covered in clay as she shaped a vase on her wheel. We were in her pottery shop, a cluttered space filled with the earthy smell of wet clay and the hum of a kiln. Her walls were lined with her work, bowls and mugs glazed in blues and greens, each one imperfect but alive. I envied her confidence, the way she wore her art like a badge. "My paintings aren't good enough," I said, brushing off the idea. "They're just therapy." "Bull," she shot back, not looking up. "You're scared. You think if you put yourself out there, someone's gonna tell you you're not enough." "Been there, Eleanor." "It's a lousy excuse." Her words stung, but they stuck. A week later, I agreed to show a few pieces at the town's summer fair. It was a small event, just a scattering of booths along the boardwalk, but to me, it felt like stepping onto a stage. I hung 3 paintings, 2 of the ocean, 1 of the dunes at dusk, and stood beside them, my hands twisting together, my heart hammering. People stopped, nodded, said kind things. A few even bought prints. But it was Rosa's grin, wide and proud, that made me feel like I'd won something bigger. That fair introduced me to Clara, a wiry woman in her 40s with a sharp tongue and a laugh that carried. She ran a booth selling handmade jewelry, delicate pieces of sea glass and silver that caught the light like promises. Clara had grown up in Haven's Edge, left for a corporate job in Chicago, and came back after a messy divorce. "This place saved me," she told me over beers at the fair's closing party. "It's not perfect, but it's real." We bonded over our shared reinventions, our scars from lives we'd left behind. Clara had a daughter, Mia, who was studying art in Boston. "She thinks I'm nuts for living here," Clara said, rolling her eyes. "But I'm happier than I've ever been." Clara became my confidant, the one I told about the nights when doubt clawed at me. She didn't sugarcoat things. "You're allowed to mess up, Eleanor," she said one evening as we sat on my porch, the air thick with the scent of salt and honeysuckle. "You're allowed to be scared. Just don't let it stop you." Her words were a lifeline, pulling me back when I teetered on the edge of giving up. The first real storm hit Haven's Edge in late summer, a howling beast that rattled the windows and sent the ocean crashing over the dunes. I watched from the cottage, my easel abandoned, as the sky turned the color of slate. The wind screamed, and I felt it in my bones, a reminder of how small I was, how fragile this new life could be. That night, the power went out, and I sat by candlelight, sketching the storm in my notebook. The lines were jagged, urgent, like the thoughts I couldn't shake. The storm wasn't just outside. Inside, I was wrestling with a memory that wouldn't stay buried. It was a fight with Sarah, years ago, when she was in her 20s. I'd wanted her to stay close after college, to build a life near me, but she'd chosen a job in the city, a life that felt a world away. "You don't get it, Mom," she'd said, her voice sharp. "I need to be me, not your shadow." I'd carried that hurt like a stone, blaming myself for pushing her away. Now, in the dark of the storm, I saw it differently. She hadn't been rejecting me, she'd been claiming her own life, just as I was doing now. The next morning, the town was a mess of fallen branches and scattered debris. I joined the cleanup crew, hauling driftwood with Marcus and Clara, my hands blistered but my heart full. We laughed as we worked, trading stories about storms we'd weathered, literal and otherwise. Marcus told me about the night he lost his boat to a nor'easter, how he'd rebuilt it piece by piece. Clara shared how she'd once stood in a Chicago high-rise, watching a storm and realizing she couldn't stay in a life that wasn't hers. Their resilience buoyed me, made me believe I could weather my own storms, but not all conflicts were so easily resolved. Tom, my landlord, started grumbling about the cottage's upkeep, hinting I might need to move if I couldn't maintain it. "It's an old place, Eleanor," he said, scratching his beard. "Needs a lot of work." His words hit hard, stirring up fears of losing this new home I'd fought for. I pushed back, politely but firmly, offering to fix what I could. We struck a deal. I'd paint the fence and repair the porch steps, and he'd cover the bigger repairs. It wasn't just about the cottage, it was about proving I could stand my ground. By fall, I was different. Not a new person, but a truer one. I'd always been Eleanor, patient, quiet, a little too quick to smile through pain, but now I was Eleanor who painted, who laughed, who stood up for herself. The town noticed. Lila started displaying my sketches in the cafe, small pencil drawings of the harbor and the cliffs. Customers commented, asked if I took commissions. I did, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. Each sale felt like a vote of faith, not just in my art, but in me. Sarah visited again, this time with less tension. We walked the beach, the wind tangling our hair, and talked about the past. I told her about the party, how it had broken something in me. She listened, her eyes soft, and said, "I didn't see you, Mom. I'm sorry. We didn't fix everything that day, but we built a bridge." She started calling more often, asking about my paintings, my life. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Prone evening, Rosa dragged me to a town meeting, where the council was debating a new community center. I spoke up, surprising myself, suggesting an art program for kids like Timmy, who loved to draw but had nowhere to learn. The idea caught on, and soon I was teaching a weekly class, my hands guiding young fingers through charcoal and watercolor. Watching their faces light up, I felt a purpose I hadn't known I was missing. Winter came softly to Haven's Edge, the air crisp and the ocean a deep, restless blue. I stood on the porch one morning, wrapped in a shawl, my breath visible in the cold. The horizon stretched out, endless and full of possibility. I thought of the woman I'd been a year ago, standing in Sarah's living room, invisible. I wasn't that woman anymore. I'd built a life here, a messy, imperfect, beautiful life. I had Rose's laughter, Marcus's stories, Lila's scones, Clara's honesty. I had my paintings, my voice, my heart. I still carried George with me, but not as a weight. His memory was a warmth, a reminder of love that had shaped me but didn't define me. I carried Sarah too, not as a wound but as a connection, fragile but growing. And I carried myself, Eleanor, who chose to live, to create, to be seen. If you're listening to this, know that it's never too late. You don't have to stay in the shadows of someone else's life. You can step into the light, even if it scares you. Paint, laugh, fight, love. Find your haven's edge, wherever it is. Share your story. Live it. Winter in Haven's Edge wrapped the town in a quiet hush, the kind that makes you notice the smallest sounds, the crunch of frost underfoot, the distant clatter of a buoy against the dock. I'd taken to walking the beach at dawn, my boots leaving fleeting prints in the sand, erased by the tide before I could look back. The cold stung my cheeks, but I loved it, the sharpness, the clarity. It reminded me I was here, alive, not just a shadow in someone else's story. My paintings were piling up now, stacked against the cottage walls like chapters of a book I was still writing. I'd started experimenting with bolder colors, fiery reds, and deep indigos, trying to capture the way the ocean seemed to hold both rage and peace. One morning, as I mixed paint on the porch, a memory surfaced, unbidden but vivid. I was 25, standing in our old apartment, George beside me, both of us laughing as we tried to paint the nursery for Sarah. We'd gotten more paint on each other than the walls, our hands smeared with soft yellow, our laughter echoing. I hadn't painted since then, not really. Life had gotten in the way, diapers, bills, PTA meetings. I'd told myself it was fine, that being a mother, a wife, was enough. But now, with the brush in my hand, I realized how much I'd given up. The ache of that loss was real, but so was the joy of reclaiming it. I started teaching my art class at the community center, a drafty room above the library that smelled of old books and pine cleaner. My students were a mix, kids like Timmy, with wide eyes and smudged fingers, and a few adults, retirees mostly, looking for something to fill their days. There was Helen, a quiet woman in her 70s who painted delicate watercolors of flowers, her hands trembling but her focus fierce. She'd been a nurse, she told me, worked double shifts to raise her kids after her husband left. Never thought I'd have time for this, she said, holding up a painting of roses. Feels like stealing time back. Her words hit me hard. I wasn't the only one starting over, but not everyone was kind. One student, a man named Carl, was a retired accountant with a sharp tongue and sharper opinions. He'd critique everyone's work, his voice loud enough to make Timmy flinch. "Eleanor, this class is a mess," he said one day, gesturing at my students' canvases. "You need structure, not this chaos." I felt my face burn, the old instinct to shrink kicking in. But then I saw Timmy, clutching his painting of a lopsided boat, his eyes downcast. I straightened up. "Carl," I said, my voice steady, "this isn't about perfection. It's about expression. If you don't like it, you're welcome to leave." The room went quiet, and for a moment, I thought I'd gone too far. But Helen clapped, and Timmy grinned, and Carl muttered something and stayed. It was a small victory, but it felt like a mountain climbed. That night, I sat by the fire, sketching Carl's scowl in my notebook, turning it into something softer, almost comical. Rosa would have laughed, called it my revenge doodle. But it wasn't revenge. It was proof I could stand up, not just for myself but for others. I was learning to hold my ground, one brushstroke at a time. Spring brought new challenges. The cottage, my haven, was showing its age. The roof leaked during a rainstorm, dripping into a bucket I placed by the kitchen table. Tom, my landlord, came by, his face grim. Eleanor, this place needs more than paint and a hammer. I'm thinking of selling. My heart sank. Selling meant I could lose this place, this life I'd built. I pleaded with him, my voice shaking. Give me a chance, Tom. I'll fix what I can. I'll make it work. He sighed, rubbed his beard, and agreed to give me 6 months. But it's gotta hold up, he warned. I threw myself into repairs, learning as I went. Marcus helped, teaching me how to patch drywall and replace rotted boards. His hands were steady, his stories endless, tales of storms at sea, of nights when he thought he'd never make it home. You're tougher than you look, Eleanor, he said one day, handing me a hammer. Always were. His words warmed me, but they also scared me. Toughness wasn't enough if I lost the cottage. Clara pitched in too, bringing her toolbox and her sharp wit. This place is a dump, she said, grinning as we sanded the porch railing. But it's your dump. We laughed, the sound mingling with the crash of waves below. Clara had her own battles. She'd been fighting with Mia, her daughter, who thought Haven's Edge was a dead end. She doesn't get it, Clara said, her voice tight. This isn't giving up. It's choosing. I nodded, understanding more than I could say. Choosing myself had cost me too, but it was worth it. The hardest fracture came with Sarah. She called one evening, her voice strained. Mom, I'm getting married. The news hit like a wave, joy mixed with something sharper. She invited me to the city for the engagement party, and I went, my heart a tangle of hope and fear. The party was at a sleek restaurant, all glass and chrome, the kind of place that made me feel old and out of place. Sarah's fiancé, James, was kind, his smile genuine, but the room was full of her friends, young and polished, their laughter loud. I stood by the bar, clutching a glass of wine, feeling that old invisibility creep in. Sarah found me, her face flushed. Mom, you're so quiet. Are you okay? I wanted to tell her the truth, that I felt like a stranger here, that I missed the days when we were enough for each other. But I smiled, said I was fine. It was a lie, but a kind one. Back in Haven's Edge, I painted through the pain, pouring it onto the canvas, dark grays and blues, jagged lines like a storm breaking. Lila noticed, brought me tea one night at the cafe. You're carrying something heavy, she said, her eyes soft. I told her about Sarah, about the party, about the fear that I'd never fit into her world again. Lila listened, then squeezed my hand. You're building your own world, Eleanor. She'll find her way to it, or she won't. But you're enough. Her words were a balm, soothing the raw edges of my heart. By summer, the cottage was holding up, thanks to Marcus, Clara, and my own stubbornness. I'd painted the walls a soft cream, fixed the porch steps, even planted a small herb garden by the door, basil and rosemary, their scents mingling with the salt air. Tom came by, nodded approvingly. You've got grit, Eleanor, he said. I'll hold off on selling, for now. It wasn't a promise, but it was enough. The art class grew, spilling into a second session. Timmy's paintings were getting bolder, his boats now joined by whales and stormy skies. Helen started teaching too, sharing her watercolor tricks with the kids. Even Carl softened, bringing cookies one day as an apology for his grumbling. Didn't mean to be a jerk, he muttered, and I smiled, forgiving him. The class wasn't just about art anymore, it was a community, a place where we all showed up, flaws and all. Rosa pushed me to do more. You need a show, she said, her eyes gleaming. A real one, not just the fair. I resisted, but she was relentless, booking a space at the town hall for a fall exhibition. I spent weeks preparing, painting late into the night, my hands cramped but my heart full. The show was small, just locals and a few tourists, but it felt huge. My paintings lined the walls, oceans, dunes, the weathered faces of Haven's Edge. People lingered, asked questions, saw me. Sarah came, surprising me, her eyes wide as she took in my work. "Mom," she said, her voice soft, "I had no idea. We didn't fix everything that night, but we talked, really talked, and it felt like a door opening." Fall came, and with it, a quiet certainty. I stood on the beach one morning, the air crisp, the waves gentle. I thought of the woman I'd been 2 years ago, standing in Sarah's living room, invisible. I wasn't her anymore. I was Eleanor, painter, teacher, friend. I'd built a life here, not perfect but mine. Rosa's laughter, Marcus's stories, Lila's scones, Clara's honesty, they were my anchors. Sarah was part of my story too, not the center but a thread, woven into the tapestry of who I was becoming. I scattered the last of George's ashes that day, letting the wind carry them over the water. "We did okay, didn't we?" I whispered. The ocean didn't answer, but it didn't need to. I felt him in the salt on my skin, the rhythm of the waves. I felt myself, too, stronger, surer, alive. If you're listening, know this: you're never too old, too broken, too lost to start again. Choose yourself, even when it's hard. Find your people, your place, your voice. Paint your story, messy and bold, and share it with the world. You are enough. The air in Haven's Edge turned crisp as fall deepened, carrying the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. I'd grown used to the rhythm of the town, the way the fishing boats creaked at dawn, the hum of the cafe as Lila poured coffee, the soft chatter of my art students as they smeared paint across their canvases. But even in this new life, there were moments when the past reached out, its fingers cold and insistent. One such moment came on a rainy afternoon, when I found an old letter tucked in a book I'd brought from the city, a letter from George, written during one of his business trips years ago. I sat at the kitchen table, the rain tapping against the windows like a restless child. The letter was short, his handwriting hurried but warm. "Ellie," he wrote, "you're the best thing I've got. Don't forget it." I traced the words with my finger, the ink faded but the love still sharp. I hadn't forgotten, not really, but I'd buried that part of myself, the woman George saw, bold and bright, before life wore me down. Reading his words now, in this cottage by the sea, I felt a spark reignite. I wasn't just reclaiming my life, I was reclaiming her. That spark pushed me to take a bigger step. Rosa, ever the instigator, had been nudging me to apply for a grant from the County Arts Council to fund a community art project. "You've got the talent, Eleanor," she said, her silver curls bouncing as she gestured wildly over coffee at the Driftwood Cafe. "Think big, a mural, a sculpture, something that says Haven's Edge." I hesitated. A project like that meant leading, not just teaching a handful of kids. It meant putting myself out there, risking failure. But George's letter was still in my pocket, his words a quiet drumbeat. I applied. The application process was grueling. I spent nights hunched over my laptop, drafting proposals, sketching ideas, a mural on the side of the community center, waves and boats and faces, telling the story of this town. I poured myself into it, my hands smudged with charcoal, my coffee cold. When the email came, saying I'd won the grant, I sat back in my chair, stunned. The funding was modest, but it was enough. More than that, it was proof that someone, strangers, even, saw value in what I could do. I cried, not the heavy tears of grief, but the kind that come when you realize you're not invisible anymore. The mural project brought new faces into my life. There was Diego, a carpenter in his 30s who'd moved to Haven's Edge after a stint in the city didn't work out. He had a quick smile and hands that could turn scrapwood into art, and he offered to build frames for the mural's panels. Diego's story was one of reinvention, too. He'd been a chef in a high-pressure restaurant, burned out, and came here to find something quieter. Didn't expect to find purpose in a hammer, he told me one day, his dark eyes crinkling as we sanded wood together. His humor was dry, his work meticulous, and his presence steadied me when the project felt overwhelming. Then there was Amara, a teenager who joined the mural team because her school required community service. She was all sharp edges, dyed purple hair, chipped nail polish, a scowl that could cut glass. But she was a natural with a paintbrush, her strokes bold and fearless. Amara's mother had died when she was young, and her father worked long hours on a fishing boat, leaving her to fend for herself. "Nobody expects much from me," she told me once, her voice flat as we mixed paint. "So I don't bother trying." Her words echoed my own doubts, the ones I'd carried for years. I saw myself in her, not just the girl I'd been but the woman I was still becoming. I made it my mission to show her she was wrong. The mural took shape over weeks, a sprawling canvas of blues and golds, with boats cresting waves and faces, Marcus's weathered grin, Lila's soft eyes, even Amara's defiant smirk, woven into the design. We worked outside, the air sharp with salt and paint fumes, the sound of gulls mixing with Diego's off-key whistling. But not everyone was thrilled. Carl, my old art class critic, showed up one day, arms crossed. "This is a waste of money," he said, loud enough for the whole team to hear. "The town needs a new dock, not some fancy wall." My stomach twisted, the old urge to shrink rising. But Amara stepped forward, paint on her cheek, and snapped, "Maybe you'd see the point if you ever tried making something instead of complaining." The group laughed, and I felt a surge of pride, not just for her, but for myself. I backed her up, calmly but firmly. "Carl, this mural's for all of us. If you don't like it, that's fine. But we're doing it." He huffed and left, but the team rallied, their energy infectious. That moment was a turning point. I wasn't just painting a wall, I was building a bridge, between me and this town, between the woman I'd been and the one I was becoming. But bridges aren't built without cracks. Amara started skipping sessions, her scowl back in full force. When I asked why, she shrugged, her eyes avoiding mine. "Doesn't matter. I'm not good enough for this." Her words cut deep, mirroring my own fears. I invited her to the cottage, made tea, and we talked. She admitted she was scared of failing, of letting people down. "You're good enough," I told her, my voice fierce. "You're more than enough." I saw her soften, just a little, and I knew we'd turned a corner. Helping her meant helping myself, too. The mural was nearly done when Sarah called again. "Mom, I want you at the wedding," she said, her voice tentative. "Not just there, but involved. Will you do a reading?" My heart leapt, but old wounds ached. I remembered her engagement party, standing alone by the bar, invisible. Could I step into her world without losing myself again? I said yes, but I was scared. The wedding was in the city, a whirlwind of flowers and music and people I didn't know. I wore a navy dress I'd bought in Haven's Edge, simple but elegant, and read a poem George and I had loved, a quiet ode to love that endures. Sarah's eyes glistened as I spoke, and afterward, she hugged me, her arms tight. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," she whispered. It wasn't perfect, there were still gaps, things unsaid, but it was a step. I drove back to Haven's Edge that night, the city lights fading in my rearview mirror, and felt a quiet peace. I didn't need to fit into her world. I had my own. Back in town, another echo surfaced. I got a letter from my old neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who'd watched my house after I left. She'd found a box of my things in her attic, photos, mostly, and a few of George's old journals. She sent them to me, and opening that box was like opening a wound. The photos were faded, curling at the edges, Sarah as a toddler, George and me at the beach, our faces young and hopeful. The journals were harder. George wrote about his fears, his love, his dreams for us. One entry stopped me cold. Ellie thinks she's not enough sometimes. She's wrong. She's everything. I sat on the porch, the wind cold, and cried. Not for loss, but for gratitude. He'd seen me, even when I couldn't see myself. The mural's unveiling was a crisp November evening, the town hall lit with string lights, the air alive with laughter and the clink of glasses. The mural was stunning, waves crashing, faces alive, a story of Haven's Edge in every brushstroke. Rosa gave a speech, her voice booming, calling me the heart of the project. I blushed, but I didn't shrink. I spoke too, my voice steady, thanking Diego, Amara, and the team. Amara stood beside me, her smile shy but real. She'd painted a small figure into the mural, me, my gray hair tied back, a brush in my hand. You belong here, she said later, and I hugged her, my throat tight. The town embraced the mural. Lila hung a photo of it in the cafe, and Marcus bragged about it to every fisherman who'd listen. Even Carl showed up, grumbling but impressed. Not bad, he said, and I laughed. It was more than not bad. It was ours. Winter returned, softer this time, the ocean a deep gray under a sky heavy with clouds. I stood on the beach one morning, my shawl wrapped tight, and looked at the horizon. I thought of the woman I'd been, standing in Sarah's living room, a tray of sandwiches in my hands, invisible. I wasn't her anymore. I was Eleanor, painter, teacher, friend, leader. I'd built a life here, with Rosa's mischief, Marcus's stories, Lila's warmth, Clara's honesty, Diego's steadiness, Amara's fire. I'd faced my past, Sarah, George, my own doubts, and come out stronger. I still painted, taught, laughed. Sarah visited more, our talks easier, our love deeper. I scattered the last of George's journals into the sea, not as ashes but as words, letting them go with a whispered, thank you. If you're listening, hear this, it's never too late to choose yourself. Find your place, your people, your voice. Paint your story, bold and true, and share it. You are enough. Winter in Haven's Edge settled in like an old friend, familiar but heavy. The days grew shorter, the sky a bruised purple by late afternoon, and the ocean churned restlessly, its waves spitting foam onto the shore. I'd grown to love the rawness of this place, the way the wind carried the scent of salt and pine, the way the cold bit at my fingertips as I painted on the porch. But even in this life I'd carved out, doubt had a way of sneaking in, quiet as a thief. It started with a phone call from my sister, Margaret, who still lived in the city. Her voice was sharp, the way it always got when she was annoyed. Eleanor, what are you doing out there? Sarah says you're painting walls and teaching kids. You're 70 years old. Don't you think it's time to come home? Home. The word stung, like a splinter I hadn't noticed until it was pressed. She didn't mean my old house, now rented to a young couple. She meant her idea of home, where I'd be the reliable sister, the predictable aunt, the woman who showed up with casseroles and smiles. I am home, I said, my voice tighter than I meant. She sighed, a sound heavy with judgment, and I hung up feeling smaller than I had in months. That night, I couldn't paint. I sat in the cottage, the fire crackling, and stared at a blank canvas. Margaret's words echoed, "You're 70 years old." Was I fooling myself? Was this life, a mural, a class, a handful of friends, just a fleeting dream, a way to delay the inevitable? I thought of Sarah, her wedding, the way we'd found a fragile piece. What if I was building something here only to lose it again? The doubt was a weight, pressing against my ribs, but I'd carried heavier burdens before. I picked up a pencil, sketched the outline of a wave, and let the act of creating push the shadows back. The next morning, I walked to the Driftwood Cafe, needing Lila's warmth and Rosa's bluntness. They were there, as always, bickering over a crossword puzzle. Eleanor, tell Rosa quixotic has nothing to do with quilts, Lila said, her eyes twinkling. I laughed, the sound loosening something in my chest. I told them about Margaret's call, my voice halting. Rosa snorted. Your sister sounds like she needs a hobby. You're not here to make her comfortable, Eleanor. You're here to live. Lila nodded, sliding a scone across the counter. Family's tricky, she said. They love you, but sometimes they want you to stay small so they don't have to change. Their words were a lifeline, pulling me back to myself. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The mural had changed Haven's Edge, or maybe it had changed how I saw it. People stopped me on the street, thanking me for the colors, the stories, the way it made the town feel alive. But it wasn't just the mural, it was the community we'd built around it. Diego started hosting woodworking workshops, teaching kids like Timmy how to carve. Amara, now a regular at my art class, was talking about applying to art school, her scowl softer, her eyes brighter. Even Helen, with her trembling hands, was selling her watercolors at the cafe, her smile as bright as the roses she painted, but purpose brought new challenges. The community center's director, a brisk woman named Susan, approached me about expanding the art program into a summer camp for kids across the county. You've got a gift, Eleanor, she said, her clipboard clutched like a shield. We could reach so many more kids with you leading this. The idea thrilled me, but it also terrified me. Leading meant responsibility, budgets, schedules, things I hadn't touched since I managed the PTA decades ago. Could I do it? Did I want to? I talked it over with Clara one evening, the two of us bundled in coats on the beach, the sand glittering under a full moon. Clara, always direct, didn't mince words. You're scared you'll screw it up, she said, tossing a pebble into the surf. But you've already done the hard part, you started. You think I wasn't terrified when I opened my jewelry shop? I was. Still am, sometimes. She turned to me, her eyes fierce. You're not just some old lady painting pictures, Eleanor. You're changing lives. Don't run from that. Her words lit a fire in me, not the kind that burns out but the kind that warms you through a long winter. I said yes to Susan, and the planning began. We met weekly, sketching out schedules, recruiting volunteers. Diego signed on to teach woodworking, and Rosa offered pottery classes. Amara, to my surprise, volunteered to help with the younger kids, her usual sarcasm tempered by a quiet pride. The camp took shape, a patchwork of art and laughter and possibility. But it wasn't all smooth. Susan was a stickler for details, and we clashed over budgets, her practicality grating against my vision for more supplies, more space. One meeting ended with me storming out, my hands shaking. She doesn't get it, I told Marcus later, pacing his boat. He listened, his hand steady on a rope, and said, nobody gets it until you show them, Eleanor. Keep going. So I did, finding compromises, holding my ground, learning to lead without losing myself. Spring brought a new test. Margaret showed up unannounced, her car pulling into my driveway on a rainy morning. She stood on the porch, her coat damp, her face a mix of curiosity and disapproval. I had to see it for myself, she said, glancing at the cottage, the easel, the herb garden. We sat at the kitchen table, the air thick with the scent of rosemary and tea, and talked. She didn't understand, how could she, but she listened as I told her about the mural, the camp, the people who'd become my family. You're different, she said finally, her voice softer. Happier. It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough. When she left, I felt a weight lift, not her approval, but the need for it. Sarah came too, with James, for the camp's opening day. The community center was alive with kids, paint smudged on their faces, laughter echoing. Sarah watched me lead a painting session, her eyes wide. "Mom, this is incredible," she said later, her voice thick. We walked the beach that evening, the tide gentle, and talked about the future, her marriage, my art, the ways we could stay connected without losing ourselves. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that was enough. The final reckoning was with myself. One quiet night, I sat on the porch, a canvas in front of me, the stars sharp above. I thought of George, his letter, his love. I thought of Sarah, Margaret, the woman I'd been. I painted a single figure, a woman with gray hair, standing by the sea, her face turned to the horizon. It was me, not as I was but as I am, bold, flawed, alive. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was Eleanor, and I was enough. Summer returned to Haven's Edge, the air warm, the dunes alive with wildflowers. I stood on the beach one morning, my bare feet sinking into the sand, the ocean stretching out like a promise. I thought of that day in Sarah's living room, the sandwiches untouched, the silence deafening. I thought of the woman I'd been, patient, quiet, fading. I wasn't her anymore. I was Eleanor, painter, teacher, friend, leader. I'd built a life here, with Rosa's laughter, Marcus's wisdom, Lila's warmth, Clara's fire, Diego's steadiness, Amara's courage, Helen's grace. I'd faced my past, Sarah, Margaret, George, myself, and come out whole. This life wasn't perfect. The cottage still creaked, the camp had its chaos, and Sarah and I were still learning each other. But it was mine, built from choices I'd made, risks I'd taken. I carried George's love, Sarah's hope, my own strength. I painted every day, taught every week, loved every moment. If you're listening, hear this: it's never too late to choose yourself. You don't need permission, or youth, or perfection. Find your place, your ocean, your canvas, your people. Paint your story, bold and messy, and share it with the world. Step into the light, wherever it leads. You are enough.